back on the front lines of the battlefield just in time to see the first clashes between the Soul Reapers and Aizen's Arancars, and things are heating up. We've known for a while now just how badass the head captain is, but Yamamoto takes the three enemy leaders, the trio of traitors, out of the battle right away, trapping Aizen, Tozen, and Gin in a ring of fire that will take them some time to get through. And they're not super concerned by it, but it's impressive that he removed them from the battle, at least for the time being. He really is a monster, and I'm excited to hopefully see him go all out soon, because the brief displays of power that he's given have always been pretty intimidating. With the Espadas without their superiors, Baragon decides to take command of the Arankar attack, and he slides into command very, very easily. Very number one energy, maybe, right? This guy's Fracciones bring a portable throne of bones with them, which tells me that Baragon obviously has a history of being in charge if he makes sure he's got a throne on hand. We're all about to throw down, and he just takes a seat of power in the middle of all of this. Love it. And I'm still waiting for him and Yamamoto to have a grouchy old man throwdown, but for the moment, there's a bit of a strategic standoff between them. Baragon realizes they can bring back the real Karakura town, and Yamamoto has already set up countermeasures. So this leads to us getting a better understanding of the stakes of the battle itself. In order for the real Karakura town to be kept out of the conflict, we need to keep these four big pillars intact, or the actual city with all of the sleeping citizens will be brought back, pretty much served up on a silver platter for Aizen to create the Oken. This is smart of Kubo to bring in as a plot point because it gives us a clear example of something visible and tangible for us to worry about that isn't just the fighters themselves. The loss of these pillars could change the tide of the battle completely, but the Soul Reapers are also obviously aware of this and have some of their ranks assigned to protect the pillars, and they are familiar faces but not Soul Reapers that we saw here initially, and they're looking like a boy band. I love this. We got Hisagi, Izuru, Yumichika, and my boy Ikkaku here, each protecting one of the pillars. The reveal is awesome, with Yamamoto hyping up that they got some of their best fighters, and he's not wrong. I assume that these guys were given this task instead of, say, captains, because the captains that we do have here are going to be used as more of a direct offensive line against the remaining Espada. And I gotta say, I was a little sad when it seemed like one of my favorite characters, Ikkaku, might not be participating in this battle, but I'm so happy that I was wrong, and he's here, and he's gonna play a good tactical role, hopefully, but as we'll get to later, maybe Ikkaku isn't thinking tactically, really. Anyway, the following few fights, in some respects, might have run the risk of feeling like fillers until we could get to the actual notable enemies against more major protagonists. But thankfully, these fights don't feel like filler at all, because one of the things I most wanted to see from this battle is some of the other Soul Reapers getting chances to shine, and Kubo delivered on that. Will I remember some of these villains in these chapters, say 6 months from now? Probably not, but that's okay. They were never built up to be major threats or anything like that. This wasn't really about them. They were just catalysts for some of these Soul Reapers to have some fun fights and some memorable moments. The Fracciones we see help give some spotlight to these lesser used heroes, which is what I wanted, and I really appreciated it. Because we get to see our Pillar Protection Squad show off more of their fighting styles, along with nice character beats sprinkled throughout. So let's get into these first opening salvos of this big battle. We'll go through my thoughts on each of these confrontations, starting with Yumichika. I've realized that I've barely spoken about this man, if ever. I legitimately don't know if I've ever mentioned him in any of my videos. I feel a little bad, because as I've talked about a lot, Kenpachi is my favorite character, and I also adore Ikkaku, so I've got a lot of love for Squad 11, and Yumichika is part of that squad. but so far he hadn't done anything to really capture my attention. I didn't feel strongly about him one way or another. His biggest notable fight with Ganju didn't leave much of an impression on me back then when I first read it, and that was back when I didn't go as in-depth with my thoughts as I do now. And he also helped out Kenpachi towards the end of the Soul Society arc, but even then I was more focused on Kenpachi and not so much on... Anyway, I've just neglected this man, and I feel bad about it. You know, maybe I talked about him when I was raving about Ikkaku, like they're kind of a package deal, but I don't remember offhand if I've ever spoken specifically about Yumichika. The point is, I just haven't given him much focus, and that needs to change. And now is the time, because Yumichika is kind of freaking awesome, and dare I say, the way he is written is kind of beautiful. This man is so obsessed with himself and his beauty and his appearance, and is a bit of a narcissist, so of course Kubo has him fight an Arrancar that's essentially the exact same way, which makes this whole fight absolutely hilarious. The two of them are just throwing these superficial insults at each other, and it's just watching these two vain people just shit on each other. And like, you're ugly, no, you're ugly. I don't know, it was great. I loved it so much. It was so ridiculous, and it led to the Arrancar, Charlotte. He had an even more ridiculous transformation too. Like, what is this? Yumichika had the perfect response by just laughing at him, because how could you not? It's fabulous, but it's also like, what do we do with? And Charlotte was kind of a great character. Like, of all the Arrancar that are in these chapters, I think he was the one that, you know, he had the most personality. He's the one, if I'm going to remember any of them, I'll remember him. He's so dramatic and extra and full of himself, and I kind of love it because it obviously complements Yumichika's own thoughts on beauty, but Charlotte's was just ramped up to an absurd degree. And I especially loved his big dramatic attack that just turned out to be a regular Zero. Amazing. But as funny as the fight was, the real highlight came for me when we got to see Yumichika release his Zanpakuto fully. I say fully because it turns out we've only ever seen him do a partial release due to his Zanpakuto also being kind of vain too. He doesn't like to show his full Shikai, and only does it here because of a situation where no one will be able to see him. It was awesome when he realized this and actually thanked Charlotte for putting him in that situation. Like, I can't imagine what Charlotte must have been thinking at the moment. Just put yourself in his shoes. You just used your big scary ultimate attack with all these thorns, and it's like engulfing your opponent, and your enemy thanks you for doing it, because it actually just sealed your fate. That's kind of scary, but so badass. While going back to look at what we've seen of Yumichika previously, I got to say I was very surprised by the little clash between him and Hisagi in the Soul Society arc that I honestly barely remembered even happening. Back then, I barely knew them and wasn't really invested in either character, but looking back from my perspective now has already changed everything, because there's some major foreshadowing dropped by Kubo back then, from a tease of the visual of Yumichika's full Shikai, as well as the hint that his Shikai can absorb people's spirit energy. So I'm glad I went back to refresh myself on previous Yumichika fights after this one, because that's a great setup for what we got here. Even asking Hisagi not to tell anyone about his Shikai. Great work, Kubo. My past self from last year should have taken more note of it. His actual Shikai unleashed these vines that drain someone of their spiritual power, and I love powers like this, because full disclosure, Kurama is my favorite character in Yu Yu Hakusho, and this reminded me of some of his plant-based attacks. I just love when plants are used in such threatening ways sometimes, and it fits Yumichika perfectly, because these plants are beautiful in their own way, but that actually plays into why he doesn't show this power. Because the reason he hides it all has to do with him being part of Squad 11 and not wanting them to see that he has a keto-based Zanpakuto instead of one that attacks directly with the blade. Apparently it's like an unspoken rule, so he doesn't want the people there to see what his sword's release is actually like, because they'll look down on him and he won't fit in as part of the group. It was just great, and I love that it also kind of thematically ties him in with Ikkaku, who we kind of, like I said, they're always kind of a pair, and they both hide aspects of themselves from their peers for different reasons, but it really boils down to the respect and admiration they have for their captain. They would both rather hold back and die than be looked at differently by their fellow Soul Reapers. Squad 11's just awesome. These are my people, my bloody, violent, openly hostile people. And I'm glad that this character really clicked with me now that Kubo gave us a better idea of who he is. He's a prime example of why these chapters were great, pushing these minor characters to the foreground, if only just for a moment, but long enough for us to really care about them. Next, let's get into Izuru's fight. He's also a character that I haven't spoken much on in this series so far, but what he's already been through is fascinating stuff despite not showing up very often. I really loved just how quietly furious Izuru still is about his captain's betrayal. He doesn't even want to have to hear Gin's name, and it makes sense why his resentment is so strong. Of the people closest to the traitors, Izuru kind of stands out because he was an unwitting accomplice in those final stages of Aizen's betrayal. He was used as a distraction at one point, accidentally helping Aizen and Gin achieve their ends by just following Gin's orders like he was supposed to. He was unwaveringly loyal to Gin, and Gin took advantage of that and turned him into an accessory. I still remember how shaken Izuru was after he heard about the betrayal. Not only was his captain a traitor, but Izuru also wound up being a part of that plan. He was manipulated, he was used after being nothing but true and loyal to his captain. The fight here doesn't interest me much, at least not the fight itself. Izuru fights this bird guy that ends up having really strong metal wings, but outside of the actual combat, Izuru has such cold lines, and we learned more about his personal views, which we'll get more into in a little bit. His Zanpakuto remains to be one of the coolest in the series so far. It's got an interesting look, and its power to progressively make something heavier and heavier as it strikes it can open up some fun utilization. I loved how the sword doesn't inherently seem that threatening, but once Izuru has it wrapped around his opponent's throat, well, that was great. Especially after the bird guy was mocking him, wondering what he could even cut with his strange sword, and Izuru gave him a very good answer. I loved that. It was also interesting that Gin was enjoying what he's seeing from Izuru. We haven't really gotten to see much of the traitors' thoughts on the people they left behind until this moment. Gin really seems to like how angry Izuru is, maybe because he thinks it makes him tougher or stronger than before it happened, like he grew a backbone because of Gin's betrayal, instead of when he used to just blindly follow his lead and protect him. There is definitely some twisted pride for his former lieutenant there. Moving on to another pillar defender, Hisagi has always been designed to just naturally look cool, but this confirms that his fighting style and his personality matches his aesthetic. He's very lethal, but he's very self-aware of that, and a little fearful of his own abilities. We've known he's strong since the flashback back in Soul Society arc that showed him as a prodigy, but it's awesome to finally get to really see him cut loose a bit. His Zanpakuto is essentially a chain with sides on its ends. There's probably a technical name for it, but I think that gets the point across for what we're about to talk about. You immediately get the impression that his visuals are very much leaning into the Grim Reaper part of his occupation, like he's death itself, which Kubo seems to confirm with both the title of one of these chapters being The Reaper, and his little traditional Grim Reaper sketch at the end of the big Hisagi chapter. It just thematically and visually fits him nicely. And I've always vibed with chain weapons like this. It's giving Ghost Rider or one of the Belmonts from Castlevania. Hisagi just oozes cool, which he always did just from his design, but now he's living up to his already naturally cool character. I think whenever I do get around to making an updated lieutenant list, this man might go up in the ranking. We'll see. The little moment of him remembering what Tozen taught him is brief but sad. Just like with Izuru, you feel that betrayal and that absence when it brings it up. That lesson is a remnant of the Captain Hisagi used to know, the man that he once respected, even if he's no longer that man, or maybe never was. Now that we've seen Hisagi as a kid and we know that he had an admiration for Kensei from the Visored, I'd be so curious to see what Hisagi's reaction would be if he learns that one man he respected and followed played a role in the horrible things that happened to another man that he deeply had admiration for. That would be interesting. Alright, so I said I'd talk about Izuru's philosophy, but I'd figured I'd talk about it when I talked about Hisagi, since there are some similar ideas here. Both Izuru and Hisagi's caution and respect toward violence and weapons is fascinating. They have outlooks that we don't usually see much in stories like this. The two lieutenants understand that not just the powers of their enemies, but also even the powers they themselves wield are things that they need to be wary of. In Hisagi's view, not fearing the weapon you have is a mistake, and Izuru thinks that violence should be feared in general so that people want to avoid it whenever possible. These might have been lessons that they learned from their captains, but these thoughts were no doubt heavily solidified because of the people that taught them those lessons. Their former captains were friends and allies, and in a sense, weapons that were on their side, but those very same weapons have turned on them. They understand that something dangerous can be both a help and a huge threat. And I hope more of these viewpoints get explored because some of the things they were talking about are utterly fascinating, and I really respect Izuru recognizing that violence is something to avoid if possible, and Hisagi especially recognizing the dangers of weapons, even his own. Also, just of note, the anime episode for the majority of the Hisagi fight was absolutely amazing. It felt like a big step up in animation, where parts of it looked more like the heightened quality of some of the movies so far, instead of the usual look of the episodes. It just really stood out and enhanced the manga chapters, I thought. It's always fun to see how animation evolves in a long-running series like this, and this was a huge example of that for me. Anyway, Hisagi makes quick work of Findor, and it's absolutely awesome, and I would talk more about his opponent specifically if there was something more to say about Findor, but he didn't bring much to the table besides a weird power gauge ability that in the end just helped Hisagi have some really cool lines and some cool moments. Again, these Iran cars are clearly just the perfect ways to help show off these Soul Reapers, and Findor was great fodder to unleash Hisagi and his Grim Reaper sides. And lastly, we have my guy Ikkaku taking on a very big opponent. I made it pretty clear during his time on Earth and his Bankai reveal how quickly Ikkaku rose to be one of my absolute favorite characters in the series. I've been so looking forward to seeing him fight again, and he loses off panel. At first I was a little disappointed and I was like, no, Kubo, come on. But thinking about it, I actually love this for a couple of reasons. One, it puts the heroes on the back foot for a second with one of the pillars getting damaged and being put at risk. Two, it gives more time for other characters that we haven't seen fight instead of more time to Ikkaku, who we saw an extensive fight with before somewhat recently. And three, most importantly, I love how his defeat brought about an emphasis on one of Ikkaku's defining character traits. He was holding back. Despite the universally massive stakes of this battle, where everyone should be using all of their strength and fighting to their last breath to defend the world, Ikkaku held back and lost because he didn't want to activate his Bankai in front of people. We know he doesn't want to show his peers that he's achieved it. He doesn't want to risk being promoted or being sent away from Squad 11, but even when the situation is so dire and the stakes are so high, He refuses to make an exception, choosing to stick to his stubborn ways. Like, it shows exactly where his priorities are, and they are not for the benefit of most other people. So I'm glad Iba called him out on it. Someone had to, because this is about more than himself. He needs to give it his all. Yes, even if it exposes him, but despite how much of a liability Ikkaku's mindset is strategically, it's part of what makes him a fascinating character and part of why I love him. I just look forward to the day when he openly shows everyone what he's capable of and maybe gets himself a captain position. He's just got to get over the hurdle in his mind, but I can't wait for the day when he actually goes all out in front of everyone. So he's beaten, and Captain Kumamura steps in, which was pretty awesome. Even though he's got an extremely memorable design, we didn't get to see much of him in action during the Soul Society arc. The brief clash between him and Kenpachi was mostly not shown, and we also got to see him get one-shotted by Aizen back then, so we got to see his Bankai show up as a colossal warrior, but not actually really witness it in motion much. And now we do, and this is the perfect opponent to show more of this Bankai. And it turns into like a kaiju battle in the middle of the city for a little bit, which was super cool, and I loved seeing how a captain handles this. And I'm definitely looking forward to him hopefully taking a shot at his old buddy Tozen. But yeah, so the pillars, there was a little bit of a scary moment when Ikkaku got beaten, but the pillars are being protected by these really awesome characters, and these chapters gave us some fun preliminary matches while also making sure that we understand the general stakes at large and setting up the bigger fights to come. Because this is quickly turning into an all-out war, and it seems like I might have been right with some of my predictions of the fights, but we'll see. We did also get a little bit of setup for Ichigo versus Ukiura, but seeing how most of these chapters pivoted away from it, I think I'll cover those events once Kubo lets me see more of what's going on over there. I'll address the scenes that we saw. There wasn't much, but it was setting it up, so yeah, that's that. We'll see what happens in the next chapters as far as what viewpoint we're focused on, but we are guaranteed either way to be getting some crazy fights no matter which world we're watching. As always, thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.